Hello, welcome to the second part of our psychological health talk in Health 4. Last time we discussed how psychological health is a broad concept, and we can't just look at it as, well, nothing's wrong with me. To be a successful, fully actualized human, we have to think in terms of positive psychology, because we want to all have a pleasant, engaged, and meaningful life. Hopefully, that's your end goal. We're all working on it all the time. Psychological health differs from person to person, and we work on this thing called positive self-concept, and this develops all through our life and is always changing. The different parts of healthy self-esteem depend on how you react to things, and it's good for you to notice your patterns of thinking so that you don't get into spirals and develop realistic self-talk and avoid negative talk. There are maladaptive and good different kinds of defense and coping mechanisms, and here are some ways to have a positive self-concept. So let's talk about, today we're going to talk about psychological disorders. Now, we all get stressed and anxious, or have behaviors we don't like, or have days where we just want to stay in bed and binge watch Bob's Burgers. But a psychological disorder is something that interferes with daily activities and is repeated. So it's something that interferes with your daily routine and your life situations, and it cannot be avoided for multiple days at a time. And this isn't just, oh, I had a bad weekend, or I have a breakup and I kind of want to just stay in bed for a while and avoid people. This is, I can't go to work, I can't function at all as a functional part of society for weeks and maybe months at a time without dealing with this situation. So we're going to talk about anxiety disorders, ADHD, some mood disorders, and schizophrenia. And all of these things are generally, my dog is going crazy, so having his own little disorder. They're generally the result of many different factors, and so we're going to talk about why that happens. Okay, no, we're not. We're going to do it really quick. So this could be, it could be a result of genetics. It could be something that happened in your past that then gives you some sort of mood disorder. So, for example, ADHD tends to be genetic. It's not caused by something in your life. So you don't give a kid ADHD by giving them Halloween candy, right? So, the dog really is losing his little mind. Kimball, calm down. So excited, so excited. Schizophrenia is something, again, that's usually genetic. And what else is happening? So, also, the amount of resilience you have as a person, which can be learned, can affect how your anxiety or mood disorders get on. So can your neurotransmitters. So different things can happen in your life that change how your neurotransmitters function. And those are those things that talk between the neurons in your brain, and it either can make your happiness never exist, or it can so that's a deactivation of good neurons. Not good, there's no good or bad, but it's the neurons that make you feel good. Or it can activate and overactivate the neurons that make you feel bad. And so that's two different ways neurotransmitters can malfunction. Let's go on. My dog seems to have calmed down. All right. So, not going to worry about that. So let's talk about anxiety first. So anxiety tends to be one of the most common disorders. At least 20% of the U.S. population over 18 has some sort of a mental disorder, and most of that tends to be anxiety, or at least reported as anxiety. Keep in mind this is of the amount of people who report. So there might be some bias, and especially in college you tend to concentrate the number of people who have some sort of anxiety disorder. Okay, so let's talk about the different kinds of anxiety disorders. There is the most, one people don't really realize is an anxiety disorder are specific phobias. So this is something, this is a fear of something specific, like spiders or snakes. And a lot of people either have a fear of spiders and snakes, or they just they don't like them. They're just kind of icky, because it's hard for our brains to process how spiders and snakes move, because they either have way too many legs or not enough legs, and our brain just hasn't figured out what that animal is gonna do, and it kind of freaks us out. A lot of people also report having phobias of closed spaces, so that's another one of those top ones. But the thing people have the most common phobia is actually a social phobia, and this is something like the fear of public speaking, the fear of meeting people in public, the fear of, etc., anything that has to do with meeting people or being in front of people or just being involved with other people. And this is because as humans we have this fear of humiliation or embarrassment because we want so much to be accepted by whatever group we're with, okay? So 15 million Americans report having a fear of public speaking. Okay, so that is a lot of people that just the idea of getting in front of someone else and talking terrifies them so much that they cannot do it. Okay, so this isn't just, oh, I'm nervous about doing this, but I can make myself do it. This is, if I have to get up and talk in front of people, I will throw up. Okay, so that's a different level of anxiety. A lot of people also have what's called panic disorder. So panic is an intense stress response. So while anxiety in general is it's a fear and alertness with no direct threat, and it becomes a disorder when it interferes with our daily routine and life again. Panic is a really specific, intense stress response. So we go into rapid heart rate. We have shortness of breath. You can get vertigo because you're so alert you can't even figure out which way is up anymore, and you start to have racing thoughts, and these things all happen seemingly out of nowhere. So there's no reason to be afraid, there's no reason for this incredibly intense stress response to happen, or it can happen because of a certain trigger. So you could have if you're in some sort of a trapped setting, or like you can't get out of a closed space, okay? Because remember, so many people have phobias of closed spaces. Or if there's some sort of triggering experience, like you're watching a movie and there's a sudden rape scene that's very violent that you weren't expecting, that could trigger a panic attack in someone who has a history of sexual abuse. Or it could be totally random. If you have a certain kind of panic disorder, you could just out of nowhere I had a student in class the other day who just looked at me and said, "Hey, my heart is racing really intensely." And I kind of looked at her and I was like, "Oh, what else are you feeling right now?" And she's like, "Well, I can't get my thoughts together, and I can't." And she started kind of mumbling, and I realized the student's having a panic attack right in class and has never had one before. So we took care of that. She's fine now. So panic attacks happen. So let's talk first about agoraphobia. So agoraphobia is the fear of being alone and away from help. So if you're ever out in public and you for some reason something happens and no one will help you, that is so to the point where you never leave your house, then that is agoraphobia. So you're so afraid of the unknown and the lack of control of being away from your safe spot that you just can't leave your house. And again, panic attacks, these are brief surges of overwhelming anxiety where you have such an intense stress response that your body just can't even handle it. Often panic attacks, people say, "Oh, you're hyperventilating, you're breathing too fast," and they'll have you breathe into a paper bag because, number one, that focuses you, so you're less focused on your stress response, and number two, you're actually causing yourself to go a little bit, you're losing a lot of oxygen doing that, and that causes your brain to stop functioning so much. And in this case, it's a good thing because your brain is sort of over-functioning, sort of, is a way to think about it, because it's so scared of something, and it's so ready for that, whatever's going to make it panic, that it's kind of overloading itself. So by giving yourself kind of, if you're getting lightheaded, because you're not breathing in enough oxygen, your brain kind of shuts down those stress responses, and you can go back to normal. That's kind of a gross oversimplification, but it's good enough for us. Okay. So, let's talk about generalized anxiety disorder. So, that is where you worry about something for way, way too long. So we're talking 6 months or more. So this is something where people will worry about family, like every time. This is not just a mom who worries that her kid is going to go out into the world and get in a car accident. Okay, we all have that worry about anyone we love. We're worried something bad might happen to them. This is you're so worried about whatever you're fixated on that you cannot leave the house. In the example of the mom with the kid, I knew someone who had generalized anxiety disorder when I was in high school, and so my friend's parents did. And to the point where she did not allow him to ride in cars, get a driver's license, or even take the bus. Like, she had to drive him everywhere because she was so afraid he was going to get in a car accident. And so that is an example of that's an extreme reaction, right? And so that's an example of someone with generalized anxiety disorder. Okay, so this can present as constant and persistent feelings of nervousness or even depression. So we're going to talk a lot about depression, the mood disorder, but you can exhibit signs of depression, so overwhelming sadness, the inability to ever think happy things, and this is a little bit different than the mood disorder depression. There's also obsessive compulsive disorder. So this isn't, like I said last time, a lot of people try to pretend like, or they don't pretend, they don't understand what obsessive compulsiveness is. So to be obsessive is to have an obsession is to have a recurrent unwanted thought. So you might like constantly think that, oh, I'm so scared of taking this class, I am really worried about it. Okay, that could happen. We get random thoughts all the time, but an obsession is something, in this case, is something like, oh my God, people are gonna die. Oh my God, if I don't, and this is where the compulsion comes in. The compulsion is a repetitive, difficult to resist reaction. So someone who's obsessive compulsive is going to, they're going to be obsessed. So the obsession could be with germs, and they could be germaphobes to the point where they think if I touch anything with germs on it, I'm going to die. And the compulsion is therefore, I'm going to wash my hands 10 times. If I don't wash my hands 10 times, I will get sick and I will die. And the compulsion is no matter what the social cue is, I have to wash my hands. So sometimes other things are counting, like you have to count certain numbers of steps, repeatedly checking your stove or to make sure your hair, your straightener is off, that kind of thing. So we always have, everyone has this like little fear of, oh no, did I leave the iron on? Oh no, did I leave the stove on? But obsessive compulsive is having to go back and check and then kind of being like, well, but did I really check? Oh, I should go check it again. Oh, I should check it one more time. To the point where these compulsions can take hours to get through, and then the people who are going through it feel so bad and they're so embarrassed because they cannot get over this that they just they start stressing even more than they were before. And as we know, having too much of a stress response is a very bad, it's not healthy, and our body starts to get worn down as a result. Okay, let's talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, so PTSD. So this is a reaction to a severely traumatic event. It induces terror and helplessness. It's usually due to a reaction due to trauma, such as through military actions, assault or rape that someone went through. It also could be a result of natural disasters. So if you live somewhere where a natural disaster happened, even if it didn't happen to you, you could suddenly become irrationally afraid of it happening again wherever you are. Okay, and go into a PTSD attack. Or an acute stress response as a result. It could also be due to tragedy. So many people who lived in New York when 9/11 happened got PTSD because even though they weren't in, people who were not in the actual buildings that got destroyed by those planes, even though they were not in the buildings, they were in the town that was attacked, and they had to watch it happen, and they had no control over the situation. And a lot of this is you have no control, and your brain wants to make sure you are never in that situation again, and so it hyper reacts to anything stressful. Okay, so sometimes, so basically you're just constantly worried, and again, if you have that constant stress response, we know that is a very unhealthy thing to be dealing with. You could sometimes after a traumatic event, if you're very resilient, you could actually just go through what's called an acute stress disorder, and this is where a traumatic event happens, but you're able to recover in less than a month. So this does not have anything to do with the severity of the whatever the cause, I guess. But, for example, two people could go through the exact same situation, the exact same trauma, and come out of it with, one has PTSD, one has an acute stress disorder that then clears up in a month. Again, all of these things are highly individualized, and you can't judge one person because what they went through, they're like, well, why are they freaked out? Because I went through the same thing, and I'm fine. And it's very easy for us to judge people based on our own experiences, when the reality is you don't know their background, you don't know their genetics, and you don't know how they react to things. So these kinds of things are very highly personalized and can be embarrassing to talk about. So With some of these disorders, you might say, oh my God, I know someone who has this. Oh my God, I know someone who has that. It doesn't mean you should go up and talk to them and be like, oh, I really learned about you in class today, because the likeliness is they either know and they don't want to know that you know about it, or they didn't know they had whatever it is that they have, and suddenly they're embarrassed by it. You see this in medical students a lot, where they learn about some disorder and they either go home and think, oh my God, I have that. It's like if you look at anything on WebMD, suddenly all of your symptoms are going to kill you. Or they just go around and they're like diagnosing people when they shouldn't be. So either way, don't do those things. So let's talk about treating anxiety disorders. Fortunately, because a lot of these are neurotransmitter problems, so they're problems with, so for example, when you go through a traumatic event, your brain sees whatever's happening as an incredibly stressful event, and if you survive it, you want to make sure you never, ever deal with it again. So it primes your neurons, it kind of sets your neurons up so that if anything even slightly similar happens, you go into crazy stress response so that you can get out of it. The problem is it's such a crazy extreme stress response that even if you could get out of that situation, you can't, because you're so stressed out you can't deal. Okay, so what am I trying to say? So oftentimes whatever triggers a stress response during post-traumatic stress is often not whatever the original trauma was. So you see this in military veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder who on 4th of July, they need to go somewhere where they can't hear fireworks, because so many people in the military have had people they know die through mines or IUDs. Nope, intrauterine device, what am I trying to say? IEDs, there we go. IED is the kind of weapon I'm thinking of. So, for example, I have a friend who was in Somalia, in Ethiopia, in the 90s. She was in the military, and when she came back to the U.S., she had post-traumatic stress because she was in a mine hunting unit, and they would walk through fields and try to find mines that had been laid down. Well, a lot of times they're really well hidden and grass has grown over them and you can't see where these mines are. And so she would see her other soldiers that were in her group get killed by stepping on a mine. And she got such bad post-traumatic stress disorder that when she came back to the U.S., she could not step on grass. Because she said, in her brain said, you know what? Bad things happen in grass, never touch grass again. And so it got to the point where the only way okay, let's talk about this. How did she get treated? So one thing is she got on antidepressants, and that really helped. And she really wanted to go to a psychologist, but this was through the military, and there's a lot of backlog in the military. We'll just leave it at that. So when she was waiting to get into talk therapy to try and talk about the stressor, she ended up getting she got a therapy dog, so like a real, not just emotional dog, but a dog who is trained to smell if someone is going into insulin shock, a dog who is trained to make a certain kind of bark if someone is about to go to have a seizure, that kind of thing. And the way her psychologist explained it, this dog solved her grass fear. So suddenly she can walk on grass, and it's not a problem, because as far as her brain is concerned, her dog's going to walk on the grass before her, and her dog is trained to always be in front of her. And so wherever her dog goes, her brain's like, well, the dog didn't explode, so I can go there. So it calms her PTSD. There are other ways to deal with anxiety. We're discovering a lot of things, such as there are certain behavior modifications you can do to help treat different kinds of anxiety. One is a lot of exercise can actually increase the number of neurotransmitters that are circulating in your body to the point that and some people will almost match what antidepressant medication can do. So there's that. There's also just a very recent study that said taking a hot bath, which seems like such an old wives' tale. Oh, just go take a hot bath, you'll feel better. It turns out there's something to that. And we're finding more and more that a lot of the things that we didn't think were really scientific have scientific backing. So taking a hot bath is you're being surrounded by warmth, and that calms your body down. Which sounds kind of kind of reverse of what you think would happen, but it works, so go for it. Another example of an old wives' tale that turns out to be true is if you're not wearing a coat and it's cold outside, you might get sick. So for a long time, people just knew that, okay, if it's cold outside, wear a coat, okay? You're going to get cold, and then you're going to get sick. And so science came along and said, no, it's not the cold that makes you sick, it's the germs. And then later science said, oh wait, but when you're cold, your immune system gets slower, but the germs are still just as fast, so actually wearing a coat will keep you healthier because your body's functioning at a higher temperature, which means that your immune functionality is increased, so wearing a coat does keep you from getting sick when it's cold outside. Interesting. Okay, let's keep moving. Alright, so ADHD. What is up with that? So ADHD is very common in kids, and this is where a kid has more inattention and hyperactivity and impulsivity than is expected for their age. So there are so many markers. People have been having kids for such a long time that we have definite age markers, like by this week you should be doing this. By this week you should expect this. By this year you should be doing this. And so if for some reason the brain is developing at different rates and the parts of your brain that are in the prefrontal cortex that are dealing with hyperactivity and impulsivity, then you get ADHD. This is more than just when you give a kid some sugar. This is constant inattention, hyperactivity, impulsivity to the point where they cannot learn in a classroom and they disrupt other people in a classroom. We're not sure of the cause or the cure, but we can treat the symptoms. And so the diagnosis is this persistent pattern of behavior, and the behavior is interfering with your functionality or development. And we often see these symptoms develop before age 12, even if you don't get diagnosed until you're an adult. So my brother got diagnosed with ADHD in his 30s, and it's just that no one ever really paid attention to when he was a kid and had these behaviors. He could, in the doctor's office or when he knew someone was watching, focus himself enough to not be seen as different, even though his ADHD really affected how he learned. So you could, maybe sometimes people have, they call it adult onset ADHD, but really it's this, your brain gets set up in this way and then doesn't come out of it before you even before you become 12. A lot of times though, it's with age where the brain basically starts catching up with itself, and ADHD can, I don't want to say reverse or go away, but for some reason it becomes less intense. We also know that there's a lot of medication that can help with ADHD symptoms, which really help kids focus. All right, let's talk about depression. So again, we all have bad days, but mood disorders, such as depression, are persistent and disruptive for multiple days at a time. So depression is the most common mood disorder. There are multiple symptoms that might be experienced, which can be very complicated. You could you could either get insomnia, so you can't sleep, or maybe you sleep too much. You could be really restless, or maybe you have no energy. You could eat a lot to comfort yourself, or maybe you lose your appetite altogether. Depression is really complicated, and no matter what the symptoms are, you still come out of it with this primary symptom of feeling sad and hopeless, or with a complete loss in doing what you usually enjoy. So that's one of the things they use to really diagnose it. So it's, have you felt this way for multiple weeks at a time? Because you could just be going through a bad spell. But if you've had this feeling for multiple weeks at a time, and you no longer enjoy the things you know you should enjoy because you've enjoyed them in the past, then you probably have depression. So, and interestingly, you can actually be diagnosed with this without feeling sad. You could be depressed and just not have that interest, be incredibly exhausted all the time, because depression is an extended stress response that just never turns off. And so if you are just constantly stressed out, if you're constantly, your stress system is activated, you're burning through your energy, you're storing it in weird ways so it can be gotten at easily. You're you're probably breathing incorrectly, your heart rate is going up too much. So remember, that's all really bad for you. You don't want to be in chronic stress. And what depression is a chronic stress hyper response. So that is not great. But fortunately, we have a lot of treatments, but only 35% of the people who report having depression seek treatment. And it could be because of shame. People don't want to admit that, my emotions are making me sad, and so now I have to go get treatment. Well, that's silly. It's not a flaw in personality, it's a flaw in chemistry. So again, this is a neurotransmitter problem, and it's not something that you should be judged on. We don't judge people with diabetes as just, oh, well, obviously your pancreas should just work harder. No, that's stupid. Or if you have a broken leg, we don't say, well, obviously you should just walk on it till you feel better. And yet so many people think, well, if I have depression, I'll just wait until I feel better before I get treatment. And that's not going to work. If anything, it's going to get worse and worse and make it harder to treat. But again, part of being depressed is that that's just total lack of interest in doing anything, including getting treatment. And so it can be really hard to make that happen. Okay, let's keep going. So the treatment depends on severity, and no matter what the cause, severe treatment should always be treated seriously. So severe treatments being, or severe symptoms being a complete lack of any kind of hopefulness and suicide ideation or activity. Okay, so we're going to talk about suicide later, but do keep that in mind. Okay, so there's drug therapy, like antidepressants. Antidepressants, it can be really hard to get the right antidepressant, but don't give up, because, again, depression can happen through many, many different routes in the brain, but the symptoms all come out the same, or like the end result is the same, and that is depression. So if one kind of antidepressant doesn't work, wait and try a different kind before you give up totally and think that nothing can help me. You also can do, psychotherapy or talk therapy. That can be used to help you kind of work out and again, this is an idea where if you know what your brain is doing and your patterns of thought, sometimes this can help you realize what's stressing you out and causing you to be depressed. There's also just something about talking to people about things that makes us feel better. So one of the reasons why people really love horror movies is because it activates that stress response, but we know it's fake, and so we can watch it and it's okay. And then afterwards you get to talk about, I was so scared, with your friends, and that it has some sort of cathartic effect and very stress relieving effect. And the same thing with psychotherapy when you're talking about what your depression is, and so that there's something cathartic about that helps us heal. Humans are complicated. If someone is suicidal, you should always consider hospitalization. It is not something to be ashamed of. The idea is people are going to watch and make sure that you don't die, because people care if you die, okay? And so you just always remember that. There's a new kind of treatment called electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT. This is basically, you use light, there's a specific kind of this called light therapy, which is a very mild form of this, where you basically just stare into a full spectrum light. If you live somewhere that is often foggy, or if you live somewhere really close to the North or the South Pole, you're not getting intense enough sunlight. There's something about sunlight that we need for our brains to be happy, to work functionally, interestingly. But the newest kind of electroconvulsive therapy is where you go in a couple times a week for a couple weeks, and you basically induce a seizure. And so this is not good for someone if they have a seizure disorder, so let's get this out there. But somehow, and people are still not exactly sure why, that induced seizure resets that part of the brain that has to do with depression, and they come out of it, and they're better. And they're still trying to figure out why that happened. This happens a lot in depression treatments, where we just try and find cures and then we figure out why they work. So that's where we are now with this one. What's bipolar disorder? So a lot of times people get diagnosed as having depression when what they actually have is bipolar disorder. So you exhibit all of the same depressive symptoms as you would in depression, but then you also have an alternating period of mania. So in mania, you are excessively excited, you're excessively irritable, or really, really talkative, like, oh my god, I can't stop talking, I cannot make myself stop talking. You could have a inflated self-esteem and just expansiveness. You just can't, everything is amazing, you have to just keep going. And the difference between this and just having a great day is you feel like your thoughts are running away from you when it comes to these kinds of things. So if you don't tell your doctor about so I am so depressed that I consider suicide, but then, like, that happens for a week, and then next week I'll have 2 days of just being so amazing. You're so in the other direction that you can be treated. You can get the wrong medication, or well, basically it's the medication that is incorrect. So anti-manic drugs are really important if you have bipolar disorder. And it's a different medication than antidepressive drugs. So a lot of times what's happening is in antidepressant drugs, they are mood elevators. But then if you get too much mood elevation, you get into the mania stage. So you kind of have to have something to level you off in the other direction. And sometimes this is something that has to be prescribed for someone's entire life, because that's just how the brain works. And again, this is a flaw in chemistry, not personality. So let's talk about another flaw in chemistry, which is schizophrenia. So schizophrenia is a terrifying mental disorder that affects thinking and perceptions of reality. And the truth is that probably about 1 in 100 people has it, and most people don't treat it because they don't realize it's schizophrenia. So what this means is most schizophrenia is pretty it's not very excessive, okay? So it's not so intense that they can't function, but they still have some sort of form of it. The general characteristics of schizophrenia are completely disorganized thoughts. So you express thoughts in these very vague or confusing ways, even though most of your life you're actually really good at just, this is very ironic that I can't get this thought out. So most of your life you're very good at communicating, okay? So in schizophrenia, you're basically always just kind of saying disorganized things that don't make sense. Okay, you could have either an inappropriate emotion at different times or a complete absence of emotion. So this could be funerals are hilarious. Well, that's completely inappropriate. It's not socially appropriate, and it's also just it's just not what should be done, right? And so it's just not, your brain is not processing grief correctly in that kind of situation. If you're laughing, I mean, grief is very complicated and is expressed in a lot of different ways, but if you don't even express grief when someone dies and instead you experience mania, you might have some schizophrenia. The one we think of most often, the two we think of most often are delusions and auditory hallucinations. So this is the idea that schizophrenia presents as someone who hears voices. So and what's really happening is we all have inner thoughts that we're always dealing with, but in the case of someone with schizophrenia, they don't realize it's their own inner thoughts, and instead they think it's somebody talking within their head, right? So it's a voice they're hearing. They often, because of there's a strong component of paranoia or falsely held beliefs and delusions that go along with these auditory hallucinations. A lot of times people with schizophrenia have this very strong held belief that their mind is being controlled by outside forces, that the government's being controlled by lizard people, because I have no idea where that urban legend comes from, but you see people with schizophrenia sticking to it a lot. There's something called the Messiah complex that people experience when they visit places like Jerusalem, where 1 in 100 people who go to Jerusalem say, oh, you know what? I actually am the second coming of whatever religion you want it to be, and that's why I'm here. And what's really happening is their brain is finally picked something that makes sense to them based on their upbringing and their religious beliefs, and then the schizophrenia kind of takes hold, and their delusions, it all makes sense to their delusions. And so there's actually a lot of there's several mental institutions around Jerusalem for people who visit for the first time, and their schizophrenia kind of sets in, and they get that Messiah complex. The big problem with this is that if these things start to really deteriorate your functionality at work or in your social situations, this can lead to social withdrawal, because you could realize you're doing it and then you get embarrassed, or you could be paranoid because of those delusions. It can lead to poor performance. It can lead to the degradation of relationships, etc. But that feeds into the paranoia. So your brain is not thinking, oh, it's my behavior that's causing people to withdraw from me. They're thinking, oh, well, you're all part of the plot to control me, or whatever the thought is. Okay, this can be very, very gradual. A lot of times these people are in grave danger. They believe they're in grave danger of being harmed, and so then they become incredible risks of suicide. The idea being, well, I'll get me before you do. And so in these cases, these people very often need to be treated by professional help and medication, and often have to be treated at the hospital in emergency situations. Okay, so let's talk about that. The big scary word, suicide. So suicide is the second leading cause of death for young people, so people aged 15 to 24, the first being accidents. And it's higher among men than women because there's a lot of social bias for men to hold all their feelings in and let everyone think they're big and they're, macho and they have a lot of bravado, when actually they're dealing with a lot of depression and anxiety that they don't talk about. Whereas women are expected to, we have this idea that we're going to talk to each other about how we're feeling, and hopefully that alleviates some suicidal thoughts. There is an interesting fact that suicide is illegal. And so the reason why suicide is illegal, it's not a cynical reason that, obviously, like when I was younger and had a lot of bravado, it's like, well, obviously suicide's illegal because they don't, if you die, who's going to pay your taxes? No, it has nothing to do with that. It's because if suicide is illegal, that means that you can, if someone is committing suicide, the police have the right to break into their house to stop that suicide. If it wasn't illegal, then they would have to get a warrant first, and then it would be too late. Okay, so interesting fact there. And any kind of rescue worker is then legally allowed to break into someone's home if someone's committing suicide or has committed suicide, so that they can try and rescue that person. So it's terrifying. This is such a big deal, but it's such a huge problem. And there's almost always signs, like cries for help or subtle conversation that a person might be suicidal. And here's the thing. So people who've never had to deal with suicide there's kind of a blasé feeling to it that, obviously this person is very, very selfish for putting other people through this. But your primary function as an organism is to survive. And so if you're overriding on purpose, trying to override that functionality to just survive, something is very wrong in your brain, and you need to get treatment, okay? So this is something that a lot of people deal with, and they get embarrassed about it, and that actually just makes them feel worse about it, and then it goes on, and it goes on, but you don't know who you would affect with your suicide, and that's one of these things that, people who are suicidal try and reach out in weird and subtle ways because they just want to feel important again, because as humans, we want to feel important, okay? We want to feel like we matter to at least somebody, okay? So if you know someone and you worry that they're suicidal, you should watch for things such as any mention of dying, disappearing, or self-harm. So this is kind of a problem in the dying thing, is a problem in social media right now, because there's a lot of memes about, like, well, why would I want to be immortal? Life is horrible and I'm a garbage can, or whatever it is, okay? So people joke about dying, but if you're actually suicidal, this is something we as educators are always trained to watch for. If someone mentions dying, they become much more observed to make sure that they aren't actually thinking about or talking about it. If people talk about disappearing, or they start talking about self-harm, or asking, have you ever been a cutter? Maybe that's a cue that you should be watching this person. So, sudden changes in personality. So you always hear, you hear a lot about, this person was really bubbly and happy, and then just suddenly they got really sad, and they just withdrew completely. And usually what that means is something happened in their life, and that could be a sign that suicide could be the next step. So that's something to watch for. On the other hand, one of those changes could be this sudden, unexplained lightening of mood. So they were always really depressed. You always hear so many suicides, like, we had no idea they were so happy. And a lot of times this is because people have made the decision, the only thing they can control in their life is to kill themselves. And so that's why this is especially important to be watching for. So if you aren't someone dealing with depression or anxiety and you see someone suddenly cheer up, you might think, oh good, they're over it, whatever they were dealing with. But if you're someone who is dealing with depression and anxiety or bipolar or schizophrenia, and suddenly you become incredibly cheerful, it could be that you've made a suicide plan and you have plans to carry it out. And so people should be very conscious of this kind of thing. You also could see people give away a lot of important possessions. The idea is they're getting ready for death, and so you want to watch for this. And you also see an increase in reckless behavior. So people who are suicidal tend to think, well, why should I worry? I want to die anyway. So that's something to watch out for. Okay, so there are so many risk factors for suicide. I don't want to go over to all of them, but I do want to mention that any kind of There's just so many things always that could lead someone to suicide, someone who you thought otherwise might be they're so fine, I don't understand. Anytime you have availability of a weapon, that becomes an easy way for someone to then use it to commit suicide. Guns are used more often in suicide than homicide. If you have a family history of suicide, that becomes especially something to watch somebody about, because they could be genetically predisposed to suicide themselves, or the fact that a family member has committed suicide could then make that person more likely to commit suicide themselves because they're depressed as a result. There are a lot of times if there's a famous person who has committed suicide, there are often people who in the general population who then commit suicide because they either see that the person they really respected has died, or they say, oh, well, it's kind of a permissive thing. So, someone's committed suicide and everyone paid so much attention, I might as well. If you live in the Bay, if you go visit the Bay Area or live in the Bay Area and you've ever taken the trains, you know that the BART, there will often be delays due to accident. Well, sometimes those accidents are actually suicides where someone has jumped in front of the train. They never say it's a suicide, though, because whenever that happens and they announce that there's been a suicide on the track, you suddenly see so many more suicides right afterwards, because other people who've been looking for a plan suddenly see a plan that's worked, and then they do it as well. So you don't hear the news announcing that a lot of things that are announced as accidents could actually be suicides, and they don't want the population to know because they don't want more suicides. Okay, let's just keep going. All right, so instead of talking about the factors that can cause suicide or make someone more susceptible, let's talk about how to prevent suicide, okay? So a lot of religious faiths and cultural there's a lot of faiths that puts a big old no on suicide, saying if you kill yourself, you're never going to go to whatever your version of heaven is. Okay, so that then that's actually a good thing in this case, because then someone's less likely to commit suicide if they firmly believe that they will then spend the rest of eternity in hell or whatever it is, okay? So that's good as far as preventing suicide. Anyone who has connection to others, including even pets, okay? If you have any kind of connection to a person or a pet, you tend to tends to prevent suicide. That's why you see a lot of people get pets after major tragedies or breakups or etc. The problem is if you start to hoard pets because, well, one cat was great, I'm going to get 10 and it's going to be that much better. Not so much. Okay, so do keep in mind about that. But at least you're not dying. Treatment, it helps with suicide so much. So you can't treat suicide, obviously, but you can treat whatever disorder has led up to suicide. Okay? And it seems really silly, but the lack of access to lethal means is such a good way to prevent suicide. So, like I said, firearms are used in suicides more than homicides. So, 83% of gun deaths are suicides. 83%! So if you just make sure someone doesn't have access to a gun, they're not going to commit suicide with that gun. And this isn't, a pro-gun, whatever, blah, blah, rally. This is lock up your guns so that your kids can't kill themselves with them, okay? Encouraging the person to talk can be helpful, like talking to you, but they really should seek help from a mental health professional. Mental health professionals are trained to be able to take what's called compassion fatigue. So again, because we're humans and we feed off each other's emotions, when someone is unloading all of their stress on you, even you could be the most empathetic person in the world, but you're going to start reacting to that other person's sadness, basically, or whatever it is they're dealing with. And if you're not a trained mental health professional, that could be detrimental to yourself as well. And you don't want to take it all on yourself or feel like it's your responsibility to keep someone from dying. That is a very heavy thing to take on yourself. So that's why you want to take people to professional help. If someone's in immediate danger, though, it's very important not to leave them alone. If you're worried, you can take them to an emergency room, and people are trained to deal with people who might be suicidal or who are very definitely suicidal, okay? And again, they are trained to take care of this, and so that's why you should let them do it. Okay, let's talk real quick about, a couple of psychotherapies, and then we'll be done. Okay, so I really like this idea of the human nature being a biological model. So this is the idea that the mind depends on the brain. Okay, there's no magic thing happening there, which means that things like antidepressants and mood stabilizers and all these other drugs can affect your psychology, okay, and can be therapeutic changes. The problem is, a lot of times, like, so many people are on antidepressants or anti-anxiety medication, etc., that you often get drug companies pushing drugs in a way that may not be effective. Okay, so are new drugs needed, or are they just being pushed by drug companies? Or on the other hand, is some drug good, but another company has better advertising, etc. Yeah, so that's problematic in drug therapy because it is so hard to find the right antidepressant. There's this idea of the behavioral model of therapeutic change. So behavior study a pattern of behavior. So we look at the I don't do it, but the stimulus, the response, and the reinforcement. And this is kind of the idea where we have with that idea of wellness, where you want to see what triggers a response, what do you do, and then how do you reward yourself? Well, if this is a negative pathway, you have some triggering response, you go then into a panic attack, and then you reinforce it by saying, but I'm safe now, I'm just going to make sure I always do the same thing, then that's a bad behavior loop. The idea with behavior models is it doesn't matter what causes it, you just want to change the behavior. So this is stuff like exposure therapy. So, all right, cool. Things are falling down. So, this is a lot of exposure therapy. It has to do with not so much if you're scared of spiders, I'm going to make you sit in a pit of spiders. That's cruel. But if you're scared of social situations, we're going to start with small social situations and get bigger and bigger. Okay, there's something called the cognitive model, and that's where you look at your thought process, and this is an emphasis on the effects of ideas, so how you think about things could affect your behavior and your emotional state. So the idea is looking at false ideas that produce anxiety and depression. So the idea being, if I go out, everyone's going to laugh at me. In reality, no one's thinking about you as much as you think they are because they're thinking about themselves. So think about, how often do you think about other people? Yeah, not as much as you think people are thinking about you. So these kind of these things are really, this kind of model is good with people with OCD. The idea being sometimes OCD is little kids get, or not little kids, but like at some point in your life, somebody dies, and in your brain you've decided, oh, it's because I didn't do this specific step of things. I didn't flip the light switch on 5 times, and then turn the doorknob 6 times, and then wash my hands, and if I ever skip any part in this cycle, someone else will die. Well, that's a false thought, and so this cognitive model gets you to try and think your way out of it, and sometimes it works. We'll talk about it. The old model of psychology, that therapeutic talk model, is that the psychodynamic idea, the idea that our thought patterns are way too complex and ingrained to understand. So if you're scared of a spider, it's not because of spiders, it's because your mom looked like a spider. This is the whole Freudian thing. This is lots of talk therapy. It can help patients gain insight about themselves, but it doesn't necessarily fix the problem. It kind of just might help you be aware of why you think certain ways, but it's kind of gone out of fashion. People aren't as into it. So there is instead what people call cognitive behavioral therapy. So this is taking the cognitive and the behavioral and putting them together. And so what this does, for example, is where if you're treating social anxiety, you want to be exposed to it, but then also think about why it freaks you out. So again, it's putting two things together. Part of cognitive behavior therapy sometimes is to say, okay, I am anxious. There's no reason for me to be worried about being anxious. I just need to be anxious and be okay with it. So then you go on with your life and that behavior continues, but you cognitively tell yourself that even if it continues, it doesn't matter. I'm still a good person, okay? And that goes on. Sometimes you combine CBT with drug therapies, and that works for a lot of people. And like I said, this psychodynamic therapy has been attacked as being ineffective and endless because a psychologist wants you to come back again so that you can talk more about that one time in kindergarten, blah, blah, blah. Well, then psychotherapy shouldn't be like that. Psychotherapy needs to be, you need to have a goal in mind, and you need to, once we fix this problem, let's tackle another problem. Not just let's talk and talk and talk forever. Okay, there are a couple of new things that are still so new that I barely knew anything about them. So dialectical behavioral therapy, or DBT, encourages distress tolerance and acceptance of painful feelings. So both of these two things, you'll see that word mindfulness in it. And so the idea, and acceptance. So the idea is be okay with who you are as a person, and either just sit in whatever makes you uncomfortable and know, yes, I am panicking right now, but it's just my brain. I'm not actually in danger. And if you do, the more often you accept, have that thought pattern when you are panicking, the less panicky you'll be every time, or that's the theory, okay? So mindfulness is becoming a very popular buzzword, and you see so many apps that focus on mindfulness, because there's this new idea emerging that we don't let ourselves think about how we think, and if we do, we might have fewer anxiety and mood disorders. And a lot of times those mindfulness things are all about embracing the present and changing your behavior to meet your needs. Okay, there's so many ways to get help, okay? I'm not going to kind of harp on any of these things, but the big one, so self-help is getting to know yourself using books and journals. A lot of times religious belief is constructive for people. Peer counseling is a good way to, and support groups are a good way to know you're not alone. So if you share your concern, you're less likely to be stressed out about it. It's really helpful to know you're not the only person who's scared of spiders, or who the idea of public speaking makes you want to throw up, etc. For some reason, just knowing we're not alone in our fears makes us less fearful. If you work with professional help, there used to be especially this huge stigma of getting any kind of therapy, but now I've heard a comedian recently who said he doesn't even trust someone who's never had therapy, because how we live in such a messed up time and a messed up world, and we always have. It's just that now we understand that it doesn't have to be like that, and we can start to get help for anxiety. Okay, so when should you get help? You should get help when you start to feel, that, again, you have disruptive thoughts that, you have these disruptive behaviors that start to interfere with daily life, and they're sustained. If suicide is ever even thought about, you should immediately consider getting help. And if you have any kind of hallucination or delusion or any of these kind of incoherent speech patterns happening, that could be the sign of a stroke, or it could be the sign of schizophrenia, so that's important. And do understand that alcohol and drugs are going to impair your normal functionality, and so reducing the amount, so alcohol and drugs can lead to more of these things, and then if you suddenly quit alcohol, that can be almost as dangerous sometimes, because you have psychological withdrawals. So do keep in mind that, again, we are complex individuals, and we need, a lot of times need professional help for a lot of these things. Fortunately, MPC offers a lot of help for these, or can point you in the right direction. Okay, so, that concludes our very brief look into psychological health, and I will talk to you next time. Bye.